Okay, now we will. Okay, here we are. So Africom, why are American boots on the ground in 49 African countries, and why should any of us care? First question you might have is what the heck is Africom? So it's one of 11 unified US combatant commands headquartered in Stuttgart, Germany, oversees relations in 49 African nations. It was started in 2007, pulling together three smaller military units, one in West Africa, one in East Africa, and one a naval unit that mostly supplied Seabees to events in Africa. It's headquartered in Stuttgart, partly because 75 years after World War II, we still have lots and lots of US Army forces there and bases, and it was easier to do. Also because they were afraid that it would appear that the United States was invading yet another set of countries after recently invading Africa, Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's composed of, it's a unified command because it has Army, Marines, Air Force, and even the Navy and Special Ops. So the next question is why for you folks or us folks am I bothering to have talk about Africom? It's obviously not really a civil rights issue or civil liberties issue. The ACLU doesn't do anything with it. The ACLU did some good work bringing home some deported veterans who were deported to Mexico because after serving 2 or 3 or 4 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were deported to Mexico. But the ACLU of Southern California brought several of them back. And also, I mean, it's not really something that most Americans are interested in. We on LA Progressive, some of our best writers, in my opinion, write about military adventures around the world, and especially in Africa. And yet, really, as good as some of these articles are, they don't get a lot of readership. People don't care, and you don't see it's usually not at the headlines of what's going on in the New York Times or the LA Times, unless there's some big explosion that kills a bunch of people. So what gives? You might think it's a personal thing because I'm in some sense the designated veteran. You've heard us say that when Sharon and I go over to the West Side, we associate with some really good, strong progressives over there. There's a couple named Jan and Jerry, who many people know, who have these wonderful events in their big backyard. And Sharon and I agree with them up and down the line politically. And yet, if the conversation ever turns to race, the whole audience turns and faces Sharon, because there's a decent chance. I think I have to admit somebody. No, I don't. There's a decent chance. No. There's a decent chance she'll be the only Black person in the room. And you know Sharon, she's deeply knowledgeable. She's very passionate about these issues. She cares. And she knows the history and explains about racism, but I got to tell you, sometimes we come away from there and she gets tired of carrying the burden of African Americans. And on a much lower level, I'm sometimes in those same groups the designated veteran. There typically won't be a lot of other combat veterans in those groups. Now it's much lower because, you know, walking down the street, everybody can tell Sharon is a African American. They can't necessarily tell that I'm a veteran, although Sharon, if you've noticed, if you've been around her, she will frequently introduce me as a twice wounded Vietnam veteran. And I got to tell you, in 40 years, 50 years, I never say that. If somebody sees me in gym shorts, they'll say, well, what happened to your leg? And then I might say something about it. But for her, it's kind of a thing. And I'm not a professional veteran. We saw on the Capitol Hill coup, the riot, we saw professional veterans, all those guys dressed in, men mostly, some women dressed in khakis and flak jackets and their weapons pointed down, apparently like the military is taught to do nowadays. And you could tell it wasn't just on the outside. You could tell that that was where they lived. 15, 20s, there were some Vietnam veterans there. So 50 years later, their heads are still there, still in that war. And that's not me. I mean, there was a few years in my 20s after I came back from Vietnam where I wore this old faded, ragged Army fatigue jacket with my sergeant stripes and my combat boots and a bad attitude and a beer bottle in my hand. And you could see that, you know, well, he's probably one of those veterans. I better go to the other side of the street. And as I was rehearsing this morning, I remembered one time I was a bartender on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and I was walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, right next to the big Capitol building. It must have been a Saturday morning, not many people around. And I looked across the street, and who was there but Ted Kennedy and Mo Udall. And I recognized them right away, and they stopped dead in their tracks and looked at me and said, "Oh, Jesus." Fortunately, there was one cop there, Ron Kelly, who was a drinking buddy of mine, and came over and shook my hand, and we kind of gave the two the senator and representative the thumbs up. But then sometime like in my late 20s, I set Vietnam aside. It wasn't like I took out my little daily to-do thing and said, I'm going to forget about it, but I did kind of. And part of the reason I saw what was happening to my fellow veterans, a lot of them were struggling like me, and a lot of them were struggling worse. Another reason why Africom and military adventuring is such an issue with me is the night of when Baghdad was bombed, if you remember. And many of us watched it on television and watched the whole city of Baghdad light on fire. And there seemed to be a lot of excitement about what a great, wonderful thing we had going there. And I had this horrible sinking feeling, bordering on rage, that thinking, did we learn
anything?
Nothing from Vietnam? I didn't have a crystal ball. But 20 years later, I'm not surprised one little bit it turned out the way it did. You know, you would have thought we tried that. We dropped every bomb you could make on Vietnam, and how did that work out? And here we were pretending it was going to work again. I also have a certain heart for veterans. In my 30s and for 20 years before I did ACLU, I helped run a halfway house for alcoholics and addicts. It was volunteer work, except I did, for a couple of years, I stepped aside from a pretty decent paying job to actually live there with 20 guys, most of them coming out of prison or off the streets, and a certain amount of them veterans. Depending on the audience, I was either the executive director or the house daddy. And because this was down in the South Bay in Torrance, there weren't a lot of sober Vietnam veterans around. People would bring them to me, you know, like I had some magic thing, some potions, something I could say to them that would heal them. And I didn't, but I could listen and I could hold out my example, which sadly wasn't terribly effective. What I really saw that there were a lot of veterans, Vietnam veterans, who were deeply wounded, who couldn't let it go. And they weren't marching on Capitol Hill with guns, but they were working at drinking themselves to death all too often, quite successfully. Here we go. So I mentioned that, you know, we have some really good writers, and here are 6 of them. I could fill up at least another page of 6. Three of the fellows are professional soldiers. They went to West Point and the Air Force Academy. 2 of them went to West Point. All 3 of them taught at those academies. That's Danny, WJ, Andrew were professional military people, and they write frequently about Africa and about the Middle East in a very critical way. Nick Turse is a longtime journalist who has studied what we're doing in Africa for at least a decade. Matt Green is more like me. He's served one tour in Vietnam, but now he's a professional psychologist who writes about the effect war has on veterans. And Kathy Kelly is a well-known Catholic peace activist who works with the victims of our military adventuring in Afghanistan and Iraq. I will send you around after this links to where you can see these home pages. I suggest if you're at all interested in this, these are all really good writers, worth your time. But here's really why. So that's a lot about me and about why I'm interested in it. But why you ought to be interested in Africom related to civil rights and civil liberties is every nickel of the many hundreds of millions of dollars spent in Africa adventuring on controlling and invading and bombing and is money that we can't spend on homeless people. We can't have Medicare for all. We can't fix our education system. We can't pave our roads. And you know that you know that already Republicans are wetting their pants over, we have to have an austere budget. We can't afford this, we can't afford that. And yet $750 billion is designated for our defense, 65% of our discretionary funding. I believe the figure is that amount of money is more than the next 10 countries in the world. And nobody sat down at the United Nations or NATO or any place else says America has to be the world's policeman. We've taken that on ourselves, starting with World War II, and it's beggaring our country as a result. And part of the reason there's a lot of veterans in Congress, and overwhelmingly they voted for this large budget recently. So what have we been doing in Africa? We're in 49 of 54 countries. Worldwide, we spend $13 billion on special operations. Africom Command claims that we have 6,000 troops there. Nick Turse, who's the real journalist who goes on the ground, says that number is probably false, that it's probably more. He writes about how secretive they are. The military has learned, one thing they learned from Vietnam. In Vietnam, at least in part, came to a close because people sitting at home got tired of seeing young Americans getting wounded and dying in combat. Well, you don't see that from Iraq. You don't see that from Afghanistan. You don't see a single battle from Africa, even though our soldiers are dying there. And they wouldn't let Nick Turse in. They wouldn't tell him where the bases are. They won't let him go there. He can't, unlike every other war where there's always been war correspondents, they're very secretive about it. One little figure is in a year, they're spending $300 million on military construction. And that's not roads and schools, that's air bases and forts and so forth. All told, with all that huge budget that I mentioned, we have 800 bases around the world, 800.
Question?
Yeah, go for it, Chris.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that there are this many bases or this much presence in Africa, but I don't know much about it. That's why I'm here. What percentage do you think that the investment in Africa is as regarding the rest of the world? Because we're in Philippines and other places in East Asia, et cetera.
I am going to get to what other countries are doing in Africa.
No, I'm talking about where else are we in the world?
Well, we have 800 bases, and there's only like whatever it was, 60 or 70 in Africa. So all around the world are all those others.
That doesn't include the black sites that we don't know about, of which there are many.
Right. That's kind of Nick Church's point. The figures that are given out public or that are revealed are probably downplaying it quite a bit.
The next closest country only has 10 bases outside of their country.
Really? Go for it, Jim.
Who knows? Does the president of the United States know how many bases we have? Is he informed? Is Congress informed? Does anybody know that? Or
I would think that somebody in Congress is overseeing it.
well, I would think they're supposed to, but do they? I mean, are they allowed to? And who controls the information? The Pentagon?
Yeah. Or Congress.
Well, certainly the Pentagon controls it, but they set up these defense committees in the Senate and the Congress, and they staff them with favorable people, other veterans who very much approve this kind of action. Does the president know? I assume he does. I mean, legally he would have to know, and I assume to the extent they're interested, they know. Donald Trump probably didn't know. Joe Biden probably has known for 50 years. So what reasons does the military give for doing this? On their website, they say they're creating a secure, stable, and prosperous Africa. That's a good public relations presentation. And really why they ramped up in 2007 is they thought that our invasion of Afghanistan in particular and Iraq would drive Muslim terrorists, Al-Qaeda, into Africa. And they forecast a terrorist belt from the Western Africa, Sahel, to East Africa's Horn. The Sahel are the countries on the southern border of the Sahara Desert. And since in the last 14 years, they've been building bases and deploying troops and bombing targets across the country. What's actually happened, of course, is there is indeed a terrorist belt across the Sahel. There's a great increase in terrorist activity, at least in part because we have provoked it, I would say. There have been outbreaks in Nigeria, Central African Republic, Mali, and what Africom does is they take terrorist groups that have existed all across Africa and lump them together as if they're some kind of unified force. But for one thing, they existed before Al-Qaeda came on the scene. They speak different languages. They're in different countries. They have different arguments with their government, and they oftentimes are enemies to each other. But for public relations purposes and to convince themselves, they say that this is a growing threat and they need to have more and more forces there. Recently, there was a multinational invasion in the Sahel. The invasion was Great Britain, France, and the United States. And honest to God, same as with bombing Baghdad, you might have expected a dramatic increase in terrorist activity as a result of that invasion. 1,000-fold increase in violent attacks, or 1,000%. One in particular, you'll recall that the British and the Americans dislodged Muammar Gaddafi from Libya, who was no wonderful guy. But he was an okay guy when he was our guy. But then like
Right.
Like Saddam Hussein, when he was no longer our guy, he had to go. And what happened in that Libya is still an utter chaotic mess. They also drove the tribesmen, the Tuareg tribesmen, out of Libya. The Tuareg ransacked the arms that Gaddafi had built up, all the weapons that he had, and they did flee into the rest of Africa. They fled into Mali. Sharon knows the fellow. She worked with a fellow at Jet Propulsion Lab who was briefly the president of that country. The Tuareg came in and they overthrow what was a reasonable democracy in Mali and instituted an autocratic oppressive government, and that's and all of this is a result of us going in there thinking we're doing a wonderful thing. What do other nations do? I think somebody asked. So the French are kind of our partners in some of these invasions. The French were kicked out of a number of colonies in the mid 1960s, and they have tried to come back into those countries, and in the Sahel, where their countries were, 10,000 civilians have died in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, so forth. By contrast, Russia purportedly has a single base in Africa, and China has none.
Yeah, but China's all over it. I've read and I've heard from other friends who've worked there that the Chinese are ever really they're this road, and what do they call it there?
I think that's Dick is about to get to. On that bullet point there.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Shut my mouth.
No, tell your story, Chris. Go ahead, tell your story.
No, it's just I understand that there is a heavy presence of the Chinese somewhere in Africa. I don't know that it's all in Africa, but this industrial development that they're doing, and in return, they get allegiance, etc. That's at least what I read. Okay, sorry.
That's absolutely correct. That's exactly what's going on. China is going in all across Africa, spending hundreds of millions of dollars, just like we are, building roads, building hospitals, creating favor, building bridges. And they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. This is not a soup kitchen down on Skid Row. They're doing it so they can control the governments, so they can have access to the natural resources, so that they can have a bulwark against what the Americans and the British and the French are doing. And which do you think is going to be more effective? Are you going to like the guy that's building you a bridge or building you a school, or the guy that's bombing your wedding party and killing a dozen of your neighbors?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, over time, they're doing smart things while we're doing some real dumb ones, I would say. So what's really going on in the region? It's not about Al-Qaeda and resisting that. It's neocolonialism with a new face, particularly US, France, and UK moving back in to curry favor, to get access to the natural resources. As I say here, in one country alone, in the Congo, there's $14 trillion in value of gold, diamonds, tin, coltan. Coltan is a necessary for building computer chips, copper and cobalt. Africa is rich, its people are poor. And the idea, the thing we tell ourselves, or the people in the government tell each other, it's a bulwark against what China and Russia are doing. And probably that there's some truth in it, but it seems to me a wrong-headed way to go about it, that you'd think we would learn after invading one country after another that maybe we ought to change gears. You would think. What else is going on? Well, a part of it to me has to do with careers. I post here what generals make, and they retire after 20 or 30. What they are. You take a young man or woman of 18 or 17 or 19, really a boy or a girl, and you send them off to a service academy where they live in that bubble for 4 years, and then they spend the next 20 years in the military bubble. And the saying, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Mm-hmm.
So their business is to keep their business going. Well, if you really did decide to send in Peace Corps volunteers as opposed to military into Africa, well, you wouldn't need so many generals. Go for it. Somebody saying something.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens? I mean, they retire, and then they loop into, they become the head of Raytheon, the head of Lockheed Martin, or a consulting firm, or they go in and out of government positions. They have great lifelong, paid for by us influence. Well, you don't have a lobby from former Peace Corps volunteers moving in and out of think tanks, right? They're not taking over organizations. So you've got this lopsided influence on our government. You've got us pretty ignorant of what's going on, and so it persists.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget, behind all this is a military-industrial complex. There's a picture here of a Predator drone. 4 drones cost $64 million. And you know they have lots of influence. Many congressional districts have something going on militarily. Torrance used to have all kinds of aerospace in the Antelope Valley and Pasadena, and the Congress people who represent those districts get all kinds of pressure to go along with the game, and not much opposition.
Mm-hmm. And that was a conscious decision to cite these military industrial sites in all, spread it around, and certainly, and that's why you have congressional support.
Absolutely. Even Marla's best buddy, Bernie Sanders, votes sometimes for defense bills because they've got military things going on in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Now he has proposed, and he and others have proposed, taking that, whatever it was, 700
40, 50
billion and cutting it by 20% and using that money to go towards schools and homeless and so forth. And I think the prognosis is not a bat's chance in hell that'll happen, because the military industrial complex and controls what's going on.
Mm-hmm. But what about the effect of the pandemic? Or maybe you're going to get to that, but that's a question I have. Is that one way that we'll be able to reduce that budget?
I don't get to that. We can have a conversation about that. Yes, I think the country's on a precipice of dramatic change. It may not be good. I think our economy has gone to hell. Eventually the money will run out, and
Mm-hmm.
but I would say probably the last place they'll take it from is from the military. They'll work on Social Security first, and Medicare, and they'll cut all the social programs first because of how our country is controlled.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit more about veterans. I say I have a heart for veterans. So when I was in Vietnam, our company commander, who was a West Point graduate, was so proud of what he called us citizen soldiers. There was the backbone of a few officers and a few non-commissioned officers who were lifers. They were in it for the 20 years, the 30 years, but most of us we'd been drafted. We volunteered for it, but it was going to be like a 2-year deal or a 3-year deal. And that's been the way we fought most wars. I mean, World War I, the American involvement in that was only 19 months. So you couldn't do 5 tours of duty as the current Marines and soldiers have done in Iraq and Afghanistan. World War II, from Normandy to the fall of Berlin, was only 2 years. Now, some people, my dad served 5 years because he was drafted very early, but his combat tour was no longer than mine. Korean War, 3 years long. Vietnam War was 20 years. But as I just said, most of us served a single tour, maybe a second tour. Iraq and Afghanistan, we moved away from the draft, which was good in a sense, except what they did is they kept they had a program called Stopgap, where you would enlist, you had to enlist for 4 years or 6 years, and then they wouldn't let you out because they needed you to go back for your 4th tour and your 5th tour. Briefly, I was involved with the Democratic Party Veterans Caucus, and I got to know a group of young veteran Marines, most of them from East LA, and they'd been in country 4 years, 4 tours or 5 tours, and to a man, they were damaged. And that's what I see on Capitol Hill with these professional veterans, these people who can't leave Vietnam, or they can't leave Afghanistan behind or Iraq behind. It's who they are. And And so they have spent a significant amount of time in a very authoritarian environment. I mean, there's nothing more authoritarian. If you don't do what the company commander says in combat, he can shoot you. That's pretty authoritarian. And so that they're naturally in tune with a right-wing government. That's how they see the world, you know, follow orders. Donald Trump tells them to go storm the Capitol, and these fucking idiots do it. Well, and I don't think that's over. I don't think this is a one-time thing. I think this is a problem. I would say this, you know how Adolf Hitler rose to power? He rose to power on the back of what were called the brown shirts. The brown shirts were mostly disgruntled World War I German veterans who were pissed off that the government at the time surrendered in that war and then mistreated them as veterans. And they naturally came together and in a way overtook Germany. Well, I don't think that's totally impossible with all these professional veterans we've got going now. How veterans are damaged in the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. World War I, it was shell shock, combat fatigue in World War II, and post-traumatic stress disorder from Vietnam on. And what it does is you do in combat, you do things, you may do something that's against your deeply held moral beliefs, or at least you witnessed it. One of the things that stood me in good stead that didn't happen for me. I didn't see rapes and murders, thank God. I heard it was going on, but I didn't see it. That's my recovery from has been relatively less than the friends I had who killed themselves, obviously. But we do have veterans killing themselves at the rate of 22 suicides a day, 3 or 4 times the rate of other people. And then I take that another leap. We have a national moral injury. I mean, right now, as we speak, some unit in Africa is going and bombing some village. Somebody is being killed in Chris's name, in Jim's name, in my name. And we just sort of absorb that, but don't deal with it. So to me, I mean, I think we've done this since World War II. We've been in war of one kind or another virtually the whole time. So what's our challenge? We know that Congress is forever falling over itself to support the defense industry. We talked about that. The military industrial complex has hundreds and hundreds of lobbyists on California with barrels and barrels of cash, and they've won that day. And there's no president in sight who would propose significantly cutting military budgets, at least under the current environment. And I know there are anti-war groups that are active. I know Jim is out there on the street corner telling us to get the hell out of wherever. But really, it's fairly toothless. It doesn't have a lot of influence, and not a lot of us are involved in it. And mainstream media oftentimes looks pretty uncritically at what we do in these various countries. When I was a college student way back when, and after I'd been to Vietnam, I did a study of Time magazine and its coverage of the Vietnam War. And even though those journalists knew it wasn't true, they were pumping up what a great job we were doing, how we were winning the day, even though people on the ground knew that wasn't what was happening. They knew that really that it wasn't the North invading the South, it was the farmers in the field rising up and revolt as best they could as Viet Cong. And then our entertainment media glorifies violence and military daring do. I don't think you'll see very many shows about Sharon just came in. Except there was a show a long time ago called East Side, West Side with George C. Scott and Cicely Tyson, who just died. And it was about two social workers in New York. But that's like 40 years ago. And I think since then, can you think of any show where you've had a social worker go in and deal with stuff? Occasionally, but not nearly as often as somebody going in with a gun and shooting somebody in the head.
Comment?
Go for it, Chris.
Yeah, I just, what's come to mind is I think two things that you've mentioned in your talk so far have really helped make the citizens of the United States sort of not paying attention, not engaged, not knowledgeable. And that was taking the press out of war zones after the Vietnam War, and also closing down the draft so that people in the United States weren't drafted and their kids weren't getting drafted. And that's where the opposition rose, I think. But now it's poor kids who are signing up for whatever, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's the economic draft.
Mm-hmm.
So those young men I met from Boyle Heights in East LA, they didn't have a lot of other options.
Right.
They didn't have $20,000 or $30,000 a
Right.
year to go to college. So their idea was they'd go join the Marines for 3 years, come back, and that would pay for college. Well, 10 years later, when they got out of the stopgap, their lives were kind of destroyed in some ways. And that's the biggest thing. I mean, for all these other reasons, it's you and I, even activists are not terribly engaged in these issues, even though they have a great impact on our
quality of living,
our civil rights and civil liberties work. If there isn't money to help the homeless will starve. So I think this is my last slide. So what do we do? It might seem hopeless, because of the money that's arrayed. We've been doing this thing with the 800 bases and the billions and billions of dollars for military issues. We've been doing it for 50 years. How's it ever going to stop? The one thing that Sharon and I oftentimes point to is what happened to cigarette smoking. When I was a kid, everybody smoked. The doctor smoked. I remember two professors at Columbia. They chain smoked. This one guy with a big long scarf and a beret. He in an English class, he paraded back and forth smoking these Gauloises, French cigarettes, big clouds of smoke. And here we were, a bunch of 18-year-old kids, and we were all smoking and watching them. And the other guy was an economics professor who planted himself in front of the classroom and smoked these little between the act cigarillos. And he would light the next one with the butt end of the last one. And now, if the engine on my car isn't working right, it better not smoke. Right? So what can we do about it? We can pay attention. We can pay more attention. You can read those articles. You can raise up journalists who do bring us news about what's going on with our military adventuring. We can, when a lot of us, probably all of us, meet with our local Congress people, our local assembly people. Michelle, who's not here, and Sharon and I and Jim met with Chris Holden and then Anthony Portantino in the last couple of weeks. They may not have a lot of influence on these issues, but we can raise it with them. You say we can't afford to do this, that, and the other, and we'll say, well, then why are we in Burkina Faso? Get out of there, and then we could go have Medicare for all. And then I would say we could join and contribute to anti-war organizations such as they are. I think
talk about some of them. What are the ones that seem to have some heft to them?
I'm not actually sure that I can rattle off some names. Veterans for Peace, but I'm sorry, I've been ignoring some chats apparently. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a discussion for all of us. But anyway, so that's my presentation. I open it up to conversation, and I see Vinny is, Vinny, why don't you say some of your comments? Try to read.
I'd actually like to read a quote right now. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, who are cold and not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone, it's spending the sweat, its labor, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, and it goes on like this. And that was written by the noted socialist and bomb thrower Dwight D. Eisenhower. In his last speech before he left office, he warned of the military-industrial complex. And the cause of what Dick has outlined so exquisitely today is the people who benefit from it, the multinational munitions companies. That revolving door that he talked about the generals going in and out, they go. And much like ALEC or other very powerful, very wealthy organizations, they write the legislation. The notion that the military-industrial complex creates jobs is a canard when it is compared with green technology or a lot of other things, but it is sold that way. And I would close on one last thing. The first thing that Bush did, and he did quite effectively when they began the incursion into Afghanistan, was ban the viewing of our dead coming back from that war, because it was such a, he said it
Downer.
politicized their deaths. And God damn it, it should politicize their deaths, because every one of those coffins that comes back is a family shattered. And Dick, I just got to tell you, that was an absolutely amazing presentation. And I think you're right. I think what we have is a draft that is based on economics.
Yes.
It's not that people choose to go fight and die. It's because that's the only choice that's left to them, because they can't go to college and there are no jobs left here.
You know, a question that's raised in my mind just now with your comments is, I wonder if there is a reluctance to address poverty, for example, in the United States, because of its effect on the needs of the military. That's a pretty conspiratorial, I guess, sort of thinking. But that if we erase poverty, and there are talks about doing something about it now, I understand, under Biden. Where would the why would people be opposed to that? I know the Republicans don't want to spend the money on it, but is there something further behind it? You know, look what it would do to our recruiting capacity. I don't know. It's just a thought.
Can I, Jim, I know you had your hand up, but I have to rush back to my other meeting with National. And I just wanted to pick up on what Chris said. I think, Chris, there is an intention for us to not focus on poverty, because we use the poor to their cannon fodder. And then the other last point, and then I have to run, is that when you look at the age of the people right here in this room, all of us remember, not all of us, there's some that won't. I'm certain Tanya won't, and maybe Rebecca won't remember this, but I remember being a child and watching on the news in my living room, veterans or Vietnam, maybe even my own husband.
Your twice wounded Vietnam.
My
veteran,
twice wounded Vietnam veteran husband. At the time, I was 8 years old, so he wasn't a prospect for being my husband at that time, but he was wounded at that time. And now I lived with that. You know, he does suffer a lifetime of issues, not real big issues. He's still big and strong and handsome and all that stuff. But there is some stuff, there's residual stuff that carries on for the rest of your life. And we just don't talk about that stuff. And the young people not even seeing it now on their televisions, the wounded, they have no idea. No, I don't have to have gone to war to see that it's a horrible thing, because it was brought into my living room when I was 8 years old. I have to go to my meeting now. Bye, guys.
Bye.
I see Jim and Rebecca.
Okay, so I was just thinking, one of the most effective ways to deal with this would be to publicize what you were talking about, Dick. You were talking about we were bombing we were bombing people in Africa. Now we are bombing people. I think that's what you said. We are bombing people in Africa.
You
now.
did.
People in
in our
Africa.
name. Mhm.
Our military is doing that. If that were publicized, I think that would be a huge step in getting, because I didn't even know. I didn't know that. I consider myself fairly well informed. I didn't know that. You know, these are things we don't know about. This is what our military, which I think we're supposed to control our military, and they're bombing innocent people in Africa now as we sit here speaking.
I have
Yeah.
a question for
Go for it, Warren.
Dick. You say that Africa is rich and the people are poor. Who will speak for them? Who will fight for the people of Africa?
Well, 400, 500 years of colonialism has had its toll. The countries are oftentimes pretty disrupted purposely, so that Europeans and Americans can go in, and now Chinese can go in and reap the benefits. Who speaks for them? I mean, they have governments. I guess my point is, if we would work at actually building up their governments to suit their people, which is not really what we do here much in America, but if we did that, they might be strong enough to stand on their own, probably would be. Basically, if we got the hell out and let them deal with their own issues, reap the benefits from their own natural resources, they'd be far stronger than they are with us sending in CBs and Marines and Predator drones. I see Chris and Vinny. One of you go.
Okay. Where are these journalists that are covering this situation publishing? I read Basevich avidly whenever I see him, but I haven't seen him really talking about Africa very much. You said he does, but I haven't seen it. But he does get published. He gets published in, of course, the LA Progressive, but also in mainstream. Do the other people, where are they publishing? Who's carrying this news?
Yes, it's true. Basevich writes a little less about Africa, but he's written some, and he is more. Danny Surgeon and W.J. Astor are deeply anti-military at this point. Basevich is not. He's more of a traditional. He's a longtime colonel,
Yeah.
but he's still very critical of our events. I mean, you can see some of these people some of the time in mainstream media, foreign policy magazines, and on LA Progressive.
Okay.
Well, that's kind of my point, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. If people don't read about it, then publications in it for the money won't publish it. And if they don't publish it, people won't know. So, so that's kind of what can we do? Well, respond to the articles you do. You do see, if you see an article on the LA Times from Andrew Basevich, write in a comment, encourage them, because the editors will see, I mean, they'll gauge the reaction. If articles they have about what's going on in the overthrow of the government in Mali get some heat, they'll commission journalists to write more articles about it.
Chris,
Okay.
I would say that if you look in The Intercept and The Guardian,
Yeah,
and Nick Terse, who Dick mentioned, has written several incredible books.
Yeah.
There was also another book that I would recommend, but you got to get the hard copy, and that would be Hillary Clinton's book that she wrote shortly before her presidential bid. And it talks about Libya and, more importantly, Honduras, two failed states that we created. Now, Muammar Gaddafi had an atomic bomb, and he was convinced to give up his atomic bomb. And then, to quote Hillary, we came, we saw, he died. And they created a nightmare in Libya. Dick was correct. Muammar Gaddafi was no great guy. He was an autocrat. He was a president for life, but he created a socialist system that provided something that America might use: free education, free healthcare for his people. But he was a bad guy. But when she pushed for the bloody coup in Honduras, when her paperback came out, she excised the entire chapter on Honduras. And unfortunately, both our Republican and Democratic representatives are frightened, particularly the Democrats are frightened of being tagged as weak on defense. So it's an ever growing stream of money that's going to from our elected officials into the military industrial complex. And I think our efforts start with something simple. You write, you call your congressmen, your senators repeatedly telling them to cut the military budget. And as we're asking for police forces to reallocate it to the areas of need, or show the wisdom of what China's doing. China's using soft power. And if we dropped, I don't know, lunch boxes instead of bombs on people, they might not hate us and they might not be driven into the arms of the very terrorists that we're hoping to end. You mentioned about the tribes in Northern Africa. The best explanation I heard of Afghanistan prior to our arrival was 20, and I think this came from Andrew Basevich, 20,000 tribes that have spent the last 2 millennia fighting with one another, and the only thing that unites them was driving invaders out. They did it twice to the British, twice to the British, once to the Russians, and now they're doing it to us. And they will do it. And we will leave Afghanistan exactly as we left Vietnam, with nothing to gain for it except blood and treasure in the sand and a country destroyed beyond belief.
And I remember reading a Russian general in the popular press who said, as we were going in, I wouldn't do it. It didn't work for us. Yeah.
Oh, Rebecca, I think you had your hand up and Tanya had some comments.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Dick. That was very, very informative. Brought back a lot of memories too. What I see as part of the problem too, it's just so hard to keep up the advocacy of this kind of issues when you have to focus on the death, the dying, the violence, and the suffering. To me, I get burned out. It's similar to my animal welfare work. It's hard organizing, getting people around this kind of issue when you have to highlight, all this violence and suffering. And that's why I think that there is a weak anti-war, movement, because people just burn out and give up on fighting the good fight. Now, I remember Vietnam very well because I had 2 uncles that enlisted on my mom's side. One was her brother-in-law and the other her brother. And they both went in young, 18, I think, came back very messed up. And one committed suicide, the brother-in-law. And the other went through his issues with alcoholism, substance abuse, and then eventually turned his life around and became a born-again minister with his wife. They both became ministers, had this church, and now they are like radicalized right Trumpers, vehemently hate Muslims, and they're they just have this whole church that's been radicalized and politicalized, and it's scary. And they advocate violence. I remember seeing a Facebook post from this uncle who was laughing at a Bernie supporter getting beat up at a rally. I mean, that's how sick. So I'm very distant from them, but and the irony is that even within my family, they are heroes because they're veterans. And I have a cousin. I have a cousin who served. I have an aunt who served. My cousin is lesbian. My aunt transitioned, and she she was male, and now she's female, and she was one of the first to do this too, back in the late 60s, pioneer. And to this day, they're both ostracized from the family, and the family's like, oh, how could they turn out that way? They're veterans. How could they be? So it's just bizarre, and it's really sad that even with they don't have a support system within the whole family, but yet there's these certain family members that support the violence and the machinery of war. Still.
I found that it's easier to hate Muslims if you don't know any.
That's the same
Sure.
with black people or brown
Yeah,
people or gay
yeah.
people or any other people, if you can objectify them.
Right.
Right.
Anya, did you have your hand up? Or?
No, but that was wonderful, Dick. That was such a great presentation. And I think Rebecca's case actually proves that even when you do know them, if you are closed-minded enough, you can toss aside your own family members
Yeah.
with all the people you don't know. But no, this was wonderful, Dick. I learned so much, and I'm loving this discussion.
Thank you. Did I see? Yeah, I see Vinny, and did I see Chris? Vinny.
No.
My niece, who I adore, and her husband, who I adore as well, he is an Afghanistan vet, as my nephew is. And we were talking about the war, and he's a good, intelligent, progressive guy. But when I said, we shouldn't be in Afghanistan, and he responded to me, if we're not there, who would be there? And I said, well, that begs two questions. Why are we there? What is the purpose we serve? Well, stopping terrorism. But the notion that I think that stymied me so much is that idea that he had bought into lock, stock, and barrel, that we, the United States, is the indispensable nation, that we are the policemen of the world. Who gave us the right for that? It is that imperialist feeling that it is imperialism by another name. What the British Empire, the sun never set on the British Empire, what they did with a heavy fist, we've done with our military power around the world. And we don't go to create colonies. We go to bring democracy, but it never turns out that way. And I think George Orwell here said it best, or Goebbels, I guess. If you repeat the same lie over and over and over and over again, ultimately it becomes the truth. What John Kenneth Galbraith called the common wisdom. And unfortunately, conventional wisdom is generally wrong, but it's what we believe because it's the easiest thing to believe. And I also think what Trump did brilliantly is what a lot of other people do: create very simple binary solutions for what are incredibly complex and multifaceted problems. You got an immigration problem? Build a wall. Forgetting that there's things called ladders and tunnels, but it's something someone can get their head wrapped around and not have to think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that I'm not an utter peacenik. My dad retired. Well, he was a music teacher, a professor, a performer, but because he had 4 kids and they don't pay music teachers a lot, he was also an Army reservist for 30 years, retired as a full colonel. We buried him in Arlington a couple of years ago. Interestingly, though, he hated guns. He had to stay in the reserves. He had to go out to the firing range and qualify once a year, and that was the only time he touched a gun. I understand that we need a military. We need to put defense back in the Defense Department. It's the War Department. It's the Invasion Department. It's the Colonial Department. Right at early in our engagement in Afghanistan, there was a famous picture. It was famous to me. It showed a special forces soldier on horseback riding up into the mountains of Afghanistan. They put in to go after Osama bin Laden. They sent in 1,000 special forces troops. And if that's all we would have done, I'd have been fine for that. they would have found him in half the time it actually took, and we wouldn't have created 8 more enemies. They would have taken care of it eventually, or they wouldn't have. What difference does it make that Osama bin died? Did any of those people that fell down in the building, did any of them resurrect because we killed one guy? No. So anyway, who else? Or we can draw it to a close whenever you'd like.
I think the sad reality is that about Africa is that people don't care. Trump called them shitholes.
You're right,
And
Norm.
the general population, if you ask anybody or politicians, it's just not an issue. It does there's no benefit to the United States. That's the perception, I think.
In response to an earlier thing that I think Rebecca was talking about, how difficult it is to have an anti-war movement. Well, kind of what I'm arguing is we need to get down to root causes. If we're spending all these billions of dollars, then we're not going to have money for things we might care about that are closer to home. Number one. Another root cause is the basic racism, as Warren just referred to, both in who we choose to economically recruit and in where we go and spread our bombs. We don't really care. And the darker the skin, the more bombs they get. Okay, I'll stop the recording, or Vinny, I'll turn it back over to Vinny if you want to talk about chapter business.
Okay, terrific. Hey, first and foremost, Dick, that was superb. Thank you so very much. I
Thank
know
you very
that came,
much.
that was not only important information, but it obviously came from the heart from someone who knows. And I want to thank you very much for that. It was tremendous.
And
Totally
and you sent out, or it's on the chat. I haven't looked at the chat though, where those journalists are, where we can find them.
Oh, yeah, there's,
I'm going to send a follow-up message with that and also a copy of the recording.
Jim,
okay.
Dick, please include Jeremy Scahill, because he's written extensively about our involvement in Africa, and he appears in The Intercept. The Intercept is a tremendous journal if you're interested in finding about a lot of the stuff that's not being covered in the mainstream press. But I would say that most of what you can find, and certainly what I found about our involvement in Africa, I got from the books. Chiefly, the best of them would be Jeremy Scahill and Nick Turse. Nick Turse has written very, very well about all of this. And
Okay.
there was there's Andrew Basovich, and who was Colin Powell's chief of staff?
Wilkerson.
Yes, Lawrence Wilkerson. And I was hoping that Andrew Basovich would have been considered for the Department of Defense. I thought he would have been an incredible head of the Department of Defense. It wasn't even on the radar.
Oh, you would never make it. You know that.
Yeah. Taught at West Point.
Well, yeah, but then he slid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.